So thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for coming. I'm very happy to be here in this wonderful space. Some of the exhibitions that are going on these days are in a way related to the work I am currently doing on borders. I would like to start with a couple of words on the title of this series, which means keywords. And you all know that this is a reference to an important book written some 35 years ago by Raymond Williams. And if you look at that book, you don't find an entry for borders. But there is a kind of revised edition of that book, edited by Tony Bennett, Larry Grossberg, and Megan Morris in 2005, New Keywords. And then in the introduction, the editors inform us that they had planned to include an entry on boundaries. But this did not happen due to mundane and haphazard reasons. They write, I guess, I mean, the author, the designated author had some banal problems in his or her life, and he or she could not write the entry. And this is a pity, you know, because boundary and or border are words that perfectly meet the two basic criteria mentioned by Raymond Williams in the introduction to the original book, Keywords. I quote Raymond Williams. The keywords I have worked on and included in this book are significant binding words in certain activities and their interpretation. They are significant indicative words in certain forms of thought. I think that border is nowadays such a keyword. The border has become a crucial site of intervention for scholars. Just think of a kind of booming academic industry called border studies. But also for artists. I just mentioned a couple of names, Société Réaliste and Ursula Beeman. The border is, of course, a crucial site of intervention for political activists. And in the last 15, 20 years, there has been a kind of development of a no-border politics in Europe that has been particularly important also for shaping my own engagement with the topic of border. So to this kind of crucial position of the border within several theoretical and practical practices, a new centrality of the border in the biographies, as well as in the daily pains and struggles of millions of women and men across diverse geographical scales corresponds. We are kind of witnessing a dramatic transformation that was highlighted some 10 years ago by Étienne Balibar. The border has moved from the margin to the center of our cultural, social, political experience. In order to reflect upon the border, we must first of all underscore that the semantic field of the border is very complex and diverse. And this complexity and semantic heterogeneity is already witnessed by a simple list of the many words that in English as well as in other languages refer to it. Just think of border, boundary, frontier, limit, edge, fringe. So there is a multiplicity of words that refer to the complex and heterogeneous semantic field of the border. Sometimes it's quite easy to focus on the difference between the meanings of these words. Just think, for instance, of border and frontier in political geography. The border is a line, to put it very simply, while the frontier is a space. The border kind of seals a territory, while the frontier opens space up to expansion. And you may be familiar with the importance of the narrative of the frontier, for instance, in US American history. But in other cases, it is not very easy to make such a clear-cut distinction. If you think of the two words, border and boundary, they tend to be employed in a very kind of analogous meaning in several disciplines. For instance, again, in political geography. While in other disciplines, social sciences, such as sociology and anthropology, there is a tendency to use the word boundary in order to denote a kind of social or cultural demarcation, while the word border is used to indicate a political, a geopolitical kind of limit. But what I find particularly interesting today is that the very border between these words is being blurred. And there is a kind of reshuffling of the different kind of meanings of these words. This means that the semantic field of the border is kind of mobile, is disrupted. One could make the history of these words, of these concepts, in order to show that they came to have specific and differentiated meanings. But nowadays, these words are kind of overlapping again. So the semantic field of the border needs to be investigated, taking stock of this disruption of the internal borders that have been articulating it. I will make just a very simple but important example taken from the study of the way in which borders are managed in order to manage migration. If you take the external borders of Europe, of the so-called Schengen space, you can very easily see that these borders that should distinguish in a very precise way the territory of Europe from the territory of non-Europe have become mobile. They look like a frontier much more than like a traditionally conceived geopolitical border. So we have to take stock of these profound changes. I was talking about the semantic field of the border, about different words and different concepts. And I was using the word border in order to refer to the partitions, to the partitioning of the semantic field of the border itself. And this is, for me, a particularly important point. I am currently finishing a book with an Australian friend of mine on borders. And the title we chose for the book is Border as Method. Border as Method. And in order to explain the meaning of this title, it is important to keep in mind that there are cognitive borders that work as strategic devices in any form of knowledge. Among the many different concepts of border, there is importantly the concept of cognitive borders. There are cultural borders, social borders, there are linguistic borders, there are urban borders, and so on. There are cognitive borders. And in order to understand the sense in which we speak of border as method, cognitive borders are particularly important. If we take seriously the very idea of cognitive borders, to define a border, to provide a clear-cut definition of what a border is, becomes quite difficult. Why? Because to define means tracing a border. To produce an object for knowledge means to trace borders. I'd like to give you, again, a simple but important example. Let's take the most banal image of the border that we, or at least I, have in mind since I was a kid. I went to school, I had this map on the wall where the different national territories were characterized by different colors, and there were lines circumscribing these territories. So what is a border in this map? It is the line that separates one national territory from the other. But if you try to think of the very political and legal concept of the territory, it is quite clear that the territory doesn't exist prior to the tracing of a border. Only tracing a border, a territory comes into being. And this means that our simple definition of what a border is a circular definition. because it defines the border through something, the territory, that comes into being only through the tracing of a border. In a way, what we are trying to do in this book is to make this circle productive, to work through the kind of circular dimension of the border in order to get an angle on several topics, such as political, economic, social spaces, such as political subjectivity, such as relationships of domination and exploitation, that grasps these topics not as given, but rather as in the making. This is, to put it simply, what we mean talking of border as method, not only as a topic for research, what the border, of course, is in our work, but also as kind of epistemic angle on a series of topics. What I was saying before about the map, the political map of the world I got acquainted with when I first entered a classroom, when I was 6 years old, requires some specification. Because the image of the border that this map has projected onto my mind, onto my imagination, needs to be historicized. It is not something natural, of course. This specific image of the border as a line that cuts across the world, partitioning it into a multiplicity of national territories, is a quite recent invention. It's a modern invention that came into being with the birth of the national state, or maybe better, the territorial state in Europe, and that was globalized even more recently in the 20th century due to decolonization. Looking at the history of this image and concept of the border is particularly interesting and instructive. The linear border came into being in Europe, as I was saying before, with the birth of the modern territorial state, but was since the beginning articulated with other lines that worked in a totally different way. With the global lines that kind of divided the world since the 16th century into zones open to European colonial conquest, to the many frontier spaces that were opened up through colonial conquest outside of Europe. And in order to make a history of the linear border, the modern linear border, it is absolutely necessary to get kind of awareness of its articulation with other lines that provided a new configuration of the world in order to open it up to conquest and expansion. And in a way, it is particularly important to look at the modern history of borders from the colonial angle, from the point of view of the way in which the colonial space was articulated, fractured, and governed. You know, this history of the tracing of linear borders within the European space was crucial to the establishment of the idea of the political space of the state and later of the nation state as an homogeneous space. And this concept of the political space of the state as an homogeneous state was the other side of the image of the people, the citizenship of a state as a homogeneous subject. But if you look at this history from the colonial angle, then you get a rather different picture. It's not only the usual and, of course, very important point about genocide, about violence in the colonial world. It is also the fact that colonial spaces were heterogeneous spaces, were fragmented spaces, were cut and cross by borders, but by internal borders. There were concessions, there were corridors, there were internal borders. And sometimes, if you look at the way in which so-called post-developmental geographies are emerging in huge spaces as India or China, it is quite striking to see the re-emergence of this fragmentary nature of the colonial space, although under totally different conditions. You have a lot of industrial corridors in contemporary India. You have a multiplicity of different spatial economic zones, both in China and in India. So this space is a kind of deeply heterogeneous space, which replicates in a way, although under totally different conditions, the fragmented nature of the colonial space. But taking this point seriously means that nowadays the standard organization of political, economic, social spaces is not anymore an homogeneous standard. And if this is true, this also means that borders themselves are kind of working in a rather different way from the one that was kind of prevailing in the modern experience that still shapes our concepts and even our political imagination. I would like to say now something more about the way in which I work on borders, about my point of view. And first of all, I would like to make a very general point. For me, borders provide an angle on really existing global processes. This is kind of basic, but for me at least, a very important point. And why? Because, as you may remember, there was a time in the early 1990s when the discussion of globalization was shaped by the idea that borders were becoming kind of irrelevant in the global world. Some of you may remember a book by Kenichi Omae, a Japanese transnational corporate manager that was very, very influential at that time. And the title of that book was precisely The Borderless World. The point was, there is globalization, and this means that borders are going to become irrelevant, are going to disappear, kind of zero-sum game. More globalization, less borders. So we have seen in the following 20 years that this was not really the case. We have experienced a multiplication of borders. And as I was saying at the beginning, borders are more and more crucial in shaping the lives and experience of millions of men and women worldwide. But then there are other people who say, okay, if there are borders, if there is a multiplication of borders, this means that there is no globalization. This means that globalization is or was simply rhetoric, simply ideology. Well, what I try to say, what we try to say in the work I do with Brett especially, is that the opposite is the case, that the multiplication of borders is a strategic element in the articulation of global processes. Borders are key devices in articulating global processes and flows. This word, flows, is another very important word that has shaped the discussion on globalization in the last 2 decades. I may remember the work by Manuel Castel, who was kind of proposing an opposition between what he termed the space of flows and the space of places. And he was saying, again, the space of flows is the global space. And the space of places is kind of becoming less and less relevant in the global world, which is dominated by the space of flows. I think this is a binary we have to challenge. And there are especially many ethnographic works done by people like Ai Wang, Anna Tsing, James Ferguson, who show that what is really important is the middle space between places and flows. The space of channels, the space of corridors, the space of logistics, the space of enclaves. And if you take these words seriously, and you think a bit about that, channels, corridors, enclaves, they are all predicated upon bordering devices, upon bordering technologies. This is the reason why I think that we have to add something to the phrase multiplication of borders. It is not only multiplication, it is also, as I was already saying before, talking about India and China, heterogenization of borders, which may sound abstract, heterogenization, but is very simple. If you take a spatial economic zone and you ask yourself which border devices are at stake in the production of the zone itself, you see on the one hand that these border devices are very crucial and shape once again the life of many women and men. But you also see that they work in a different way from the traditional and still existing, still important national borders. If you take China, for instance, so we have done some work on spatial economic zones in China. And you may know that one of the forces driving the dramatic economic development in China in the last decades has been internal migration. According to official calculations, there are between 150 and 180 millions internal migrants in China. For an internal migrant to move from the countryside to a special economic zone, for instance, in the south of the country, in order to work there, means to cross several borders. Not only, you know, the very important social and cultural border between countryside and, let's say, city. Also, kind of juridical and status borders play a very important role in his or her experience. Because you may know that there is this household registration system in China known as hukou that makes the position of internal migrants in spatial economic zones very insecure. Until 2000, 2001, there was the possibility of deportation. Deportation, just like we know deportation in Europe or in the US, of illegal migrants. So you can see from this kind of easy example that the bordering of a special economic zone in the south of China is an important gesture. There are devices, technologies at stake that are important and at the same time totally different or quite different from the technologies and devices at stake in the working of a geopolitical, a traditionally geopolitical border. But then you can, of course, think of internal borders that cut and cross metropolitan territories, and so on. So this is the reason why I think it is important to stress that we are not only confronted with a multiplication, but also with a deep heterogenization of borders that requires kind of new conceptual tools in order to come to grips with these processes. I will just say a couple of things in order to conclude and above all to open up a discussion. The first one is that there are many scholars working on the topic of the border. I was saying before that border studies are a kind of booming academic industry. And you know, there are mainstream border studies. There are people who are engaged in writing kind of Lonely Planet of world boundaries. You can find essays and descriptions of every border, where the border between, I don't know, Belgium and Luxembourg is the same as the Gibraltar Strait, where people die, you know. Okay, it can be useful if you want to travel around the world, you get some. But there are, of course, also critical border studies, and I participate in the ongoing discussion within this field. Very quickly, because I'm already running out of time, very quickly, I would say that there have been two important moments in the development of critical border studies. The first one was shaped by the work done on, especially on the US-Mexico border, by people like Gloria Anzaldúa. Gloria Anzaldúa is really great scholar, activist, poet, who wrote this book in '87, Borderland, La Frontera. And it is really an experience to read that book, because the way in which she is able, you know, to mingle Spanish and English, to use some indigenous words in order to foster the hybridization of the language is really kind of astonishing. I must say that Gloria Anzaldúa was very clear as a scholar, but also as an activist, to say, never forget that hatred and violence dominate the landscape of the border. But this was not the point that was really taken up from her work. It was more a concept of hybridity that has really dominated the development of critical border studies for several years. But then, already in the mid-90s, there has been a kind of turn. Kind of turn that was produced by activists as well as by scholars. There was this meeting between artists and activists at the Documenta in Kassel in 96, 97, where this great slogan was produced, kein Mensch ist illegal, no one is illegal. You know. It was the beginning of no border activism, no border camps. It was a moment in which there was a kind of shock for many people, for many engaged people, in discovering how many men and women lost their lives every day, in the attempt to cross the external frontiers, as they are called, of Europe. And I want to remember that according to independent estimate, at least 18,058 men and women died since 1988. And they are, of course, reported deaths. To this, you have to add the many unreported deaths. For instance, of migrants crossing the Sahara Desert in order to get a chance to take a boat to Europe from North African shores. So this was a kind of conjuncture. I never forget this, because this was the reason why I started to get engaged in wars on borders. At the same time, there was a book that came out in 95 in Italy. Then it was translated quite quickly into English, into German, other languages. That is the book by Giorgio Agamben, Homo Sacer. So I guess many of you are familiar with some of the basic concepts that Agamben introduced in that book. The bare life, sovereignty as power on bare life, state of emergency. This book was very important in the following years. In refugee, migration studies, but also border studies. It shaped particularly the work done on a very important border institution, which is the deportation camp. Well, I don't want to discuss now, but we can do it afterwards, the book by Agamben itself. What I want to say is that this book has kind of fostered a unilateral focus on exclusion in critical border studies. And I think that this unilateral focus on exclusion is very problematic. It is very problematic because it leads to produce the image of the border as a thing, as a kind of essentialized institute. It leads to obscure, I would say, the social relation between practices of border reinforcing and practices of border crossing that constitutes any border. As some of my friends will have understood, I am kind of playing with Marx, who says capital is not a thing, it is a social relation. This is a kind of move I'm trying to do with many other friends within critical border studies. So let's try to look at the border, especially when confronted with proliferation, multiplication, heterogenization of borders, considering it not as a thing, but as a social relation. social relation between practices of border reinforcing and practices of border crossing. Which means, when we look at what is going on, for instance, around the Gibraltar Strait, let's look to the refinement of the technologies of control. Let's look at what the police makes there. Let's look at the role played by European agencies such as Frontex. But let's look also at the movement, at the practices of migrants that challenge the rigidity of the border. Moreover, I think that this unilateral focus on exclusion tends to reinforce what we can call the spectacle of the border. Its claim to effectively seal the national territory. But this is a spectacle. This is a spectacle. Because what happens every day is that the border filters mobility. The border works not that much as the wall of a fortress. It works like a system, a very sophisticated, complex system of filters. The border kills, of course. I've given you the figures. So I'm not kind of adulterating the image of the border. But I say that it is much more productive to critically look at borders from the point of view of the transformations of the very code of inclusion that contemporary borders are kind of pushing forward and fostering. So in order to close, I would say that, again, in front of this multiplication and heterogenization of borders, in front of processes of externalization of borders, in front of a kind of new mobility, elusive nature of borders, we need a kind of dynamic concept of borders. And in a way, I am convinced that looking at the border as a social relation, as a unity of multiple and heterogeneous social relations, of course, can help us to forge this kind of dynamic concept of the border that we need. I think that we have to overcome the image of the power at work at the border as a negative, merely negative power. We have to overcome the idea that the border is only a limit, negative in this sense. And of course, I'm now playing with Foucault, who famously said, we have to work at power, not through the angle of repression, which means negative kind of action, but rather from the point of view of its productive nature. Let's look at borders from the point of view of the productive power they embody, in a way. Borders are crucial in making and remaking the world. Borders are crucial in making and remaking relationships of domination, of exploitation. Borders are crucial in producing subjectivities. But again, following Foucault, we look at the positive power at stake at the border, but we look at this positive, productive power from the point of view of resistance, from the point of view of struggles. So what I try to do, and maybe I close here, although I had a couple of other points, is to work with an idea of a concept of border struggles, which kind of elaborate upon this idea that I take from an Argentinian anthropologist that has worked for many years on the border between Mexico and the US, of the border as a social relationship between practices of border crossing and practices of border reinforcement. I think that such a concept of border struggles is also quite useful in order to counteract this tendency to produce a lonely planet of world boundaries. That means this is the reason why I work on borders and boundaries, because there are struggles. So I'm not particularly interested in the border between Luxembourg and Belgium, if there is such a border, because now maybe I invented a new geography. So I close here for now, and thank you.
Thank you, Sandro, very much for your talk. I wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit more about this question of the border struggle, because for instance, in the US, this struggle has a strange kind of way in which it's been co-opted, as you will know, through this kind of vigilante moment, like the Minutemen, who present themselves as the people who are struggling for the border in the south of the United States. And they're not the only example. There are smaller groups emerging in Europe around this as well. And of course, a lot of right-wing politics in Europe is around the struggle to preserve a border. So I know that I'm using the word a bit semantically, but people do take it seriously as struggle. So I wondered if you could talk a bit about that.
Sure. Collect a couple of questions. Huh?
Yes, Sandro, thank you for the talk. I just wanted to say that, you know, the Berlin conference is very interesting for Africa. That it sort of, there were no borders in Africa before the Berlin, well, they were there, but they were sort of abstract or imaginary borders. But then the colonial struggle sort of upheld those borders that were then set in Berlin conference. And it's always been an interesting thing for me that how these borders are so constraining and so you know, so defining in terms of shaping certain identities that are created from elsewhere. But at the same time, there don't seem to be any sort of struggle or fight to overcome, you know, some of these borders. I'm just, you know, it's just struck me from your talk that actually there isn't much challenges about some of these borders, you know, that, you know, in Africa, well, we have 55 countries now, or it's now 56, with the south of Sudan. That's also another struggle of a border between the Arab-speaking North Sudan versus the Bantu-speaking. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I really appreciated the way you slowly took us through the points. I could really, really follow and build up to the point of the struggle. I'm also kind of continuing to what you were saying about the struggle around the border. I wanted to ask you a little bit more to perhaps say something about connection between what you mentioned in the beginning around this sort of the connection between globalization and border multiplication and the right to self-determination. So, for example, in the former Yugoslavia, where I'm from, and that the borders are kind of shifting all the time, with Croatia next year probably joining the EU, it's going to go, that border that I cross very often between Bosnia and Croatia is going to seem quite different next year. So, and there was a point in the 90s with this whole kind of like, each country can have the right to sort of become independent. So I wanted to just, if you could maybe just say something about how do these things connect or not connect, or, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'd just like to say thank you for your talk. That's all.
Thank you. Or maybe I can start to yeah, because already then we go on, eh? Then we go on, of course, but just because otherwise I lose the thread, you know. So I try to be short, although I mean there are, of course. Thank you very much. There are, of course, very, very important question. Yes, I mean, Yugoslavia was, I mean, also for me, very, very important in kind of prompting the work on borders. And I have been particularly working a lot in the last year with a Yugoslavian feminist, Rada Ivekovic, who has a very interesting way of looking at borders and the partitions from the point of view of languages and translation. And I will just tell an anecdote. Last year, I was teaching for a couple of weeks in Ljubljana, and I was talking with students, very smart students. Their English is wonderful. I was impressed, you know. But why? Why? Because they are compelled to read in English. You know, because they have the books in Serbo-Croatian and they cannot understand those books. And so there was a student that was saying, you know, the other day we had a lecture on Aristotle, and our professor was using a Serbo-Croatian translation. We were using the English translation. I mean, and the texts were totally different, you know. So there was a radical misunderstanding between us. But then these students were saying something else, meaning that when Slovenian teenagers go to the seaside in Croatia in the summer, they speak with Croatian teenagers in English because they have no common language. I mean, I think this is kind of interesting, although a bit mundane angle of what happened in Yugoslavia in the 1990s, you know, because you can see that I mean, there was of course the civil war, there was the wars, there was genocide, there was everything we know. There were new borders emerging, but there were also new languages and new linguistic borders that were emerging. I mean, the Slovenian language, I mean, I remember going to Yugoslavia in the 80s. I mean, everybody could understand people from Croatia in Ljubljana, for instance. Yeah? 20 years after, it is totally different. You know? So this is an angle on borders that I think is really very important, and borders and language, you know. Borders and language, and then this idea of translation as a way, you know, to work through the boundaries. And this is an insight I got from what happened in Yugoslavia in the 90s. You were talking about the Minuteman, Stefano, and you know, the easy way to answer your question would be to point to the recent movie by Rodriguez, Machete. Did you see it? I mean, yeah, it's a kind of interesting way of dealing with Minuteman. But it is a very nice movie. It is a very nice movie, although we could speak about it, but I will not now. You know, it's true. The Minutemen are kind of pioneers of border struggles from the point of view of the nation, you know, of the national territory. And as you were mentioning, there are many parallel developments in other parts of the world. I remember in the early 90s in Germany, at the border with Poland, there were really kind of gangs of volunteers that were hunting illegal migrants. You know, so this is a kind of border struggles we have to be aware of. Of course, the border, this is part, of course, of the landscape, you know, of the political, social, cultural landscape. The border struggles I am interested in are border struggles where the contestation of the border is at stake. The border struggles I am interested in are struggles that kind of posit in a radical way the topic of justice, of social justice, of liberty and equality in their connection. You know, this is, I mean, I know very general. You know, this is very general, but I think that looking at border struggles from the point of view of the criteria of justice provides a very interesting angle on a series of political concepts such as citizenship, for instance, and even you know, the very topic of belonging, of what it means to belong, you know, what it means to belong, what it means to be part of a we, you know. So this is the kind, the demonstrations in the U.S. in 2006 of Latino migrants had this kind of you know, of strength, at least at the beginning, you know. And so, as you may know, I really like this slogan that was prominent in those struggles: "We didn't cross the border crossed us." You know? And this slogan plays an important role also in Machete, but in the movie. Again, I am aware that this slogan has also kind of nationalist, Chicano nationalist. You know, I'm aware of that. It refers to the Treaty of 1848, to the conquest of Mexico, and so on. But nevertheless, I mean, it is very, very, very intriguing, you know, this kind of slogan for the kind of political spaces that it can open. the Berlin conference was, of course, very important to put it in easy way for the establishment of borders in Africa, as we know. Yeah, it's true that in Africa, but also in other parts of the world, we don't really witness attempts to overcome the borders. We have rather the birth of South Sudan and stuff like that. But nevertheless, I think that this will be an important or a crucial or a fundamental or the most important, the most crucial task for the future, for the next future, not for, you know, because your question posits a very important topic, the topic of what it means today to be internationalist, let's say. So I think internationalism has been a particularly great tradition with its shadows, of course, as we know. I'm talking about communist internationalism, of course. But internationalism was predicated upon the existence of national spaces, you know. There was the French labor movement, the Russian, the Italian, and so on. So this tradition, in a way, it is over. And I think that what we have to do is to look to other traditions and experiences in order to get a new sense of something similar to internationalism, maybe with a new name. And I think that from this point of view, several forms of regionalism, Pan-Africanism, first of all, are totally inspiring and will be inspiring for us in the next future. I think what I have in mind is the possibility, and not only I, there are a lot of people that write on that and kind of experiment with this idea, is to create the space of a region as a unit for a kind of alternative globalism, let's say. Not the nation, but the region. From this point of view, Pan-Africanism, Pan-Asianism are really intriguing and important experience to be revisited.
Thank you also by me for the talk. You said that the border is a social relation. I'm studying for a PhD and I'm studying money. So let's say that money is a social relation. I ask you, if possible, how would you apply your method to that? Real.
Sandro, thank you so much for this very interesting talk. Yes, my question is also about the transformation of the border as a social relation and as a social production. Could you please tell us more about what do you think of this neoliberal politics of inclusion? How do you think this politics of inclusion can reshape and create new citizenship? If we have to talk about a kind of new citizenship nowadays. Thank you.
Martina.
Thank you for the talk. My question is about the aim of this epistemic gaze through borders, and it seems to me that the usefulness of this perspective is not only to look at border struggles, but also to rethinking this kind of border struggle. So, for example, you mentioned no borders, and so do you think that their ways of conceiving struggles against borders had the limit to reproduce the logic of the sovereign state, simply saying a world without borders that is also now a rallying outcry of European Union, if you want, to some certain extent. So, what does maybe this perspective could be useful in order to rethink struggle within, assuming the conflictual dimension of this being against borders, that it doesn't mean to produce a smooth space.
Thank you for the talk, Sandro. It's also quite related to Marco's question. I think in the past, at least 4 months in the city, there been to all these public talks. The first talk that I've never heard the word financial crisis, which is quite amazing that you avoid, or somehow, you know, the border helped to somehow cross it.
No.
But it's also interesting in finance and also in accounting, where my discipline is, that this border is the one which created, you know, first of all, this kind of environment. But yet, in a traditional sense, when you talk about border and going back to the historical debate, it doesn't. But when you talk about Lehman Brothers, for an example, first thing you think, who crossed the border? You crossed the border to Ernst & Young. So that's a crisis brought it. So you didn't talk about it. Could you also talk a little bit about that as well?
One more?
Yeah.
Who was first?
It's sort of, I'd just be interested to hear your response. But you just sort of mentioned that internationalism was dead, and I'm not quite convinced it is. I think Walter Benjamin's theory of law creating violence is actually quite interesting on the notion of borders, and especially...
Excuse me. I come from Germany yesterday. I was speaking German, so I didn't get what you said about Walter Benjamin.
His idea of law establishing violence. And I think, as you point out, the border is often a violent thing, and that, I think, is actually the literal limits of that. And I think if you look at the way the nation states were created, that essentially was about the administration of economic areas. And in a way, globalization is actually the continuum of that. It is sort of creating sort of capitalism, this transnational entity. And as a consequence, I think the lady just touched on it, we've seen the global financial crisis, while the system was supposed to globalize the risk, it's actually globalized the crisis. And in the same way as I think actually what the global Occupy movement and the Arab Springs have sort of started to show is that the resistance to this crisis is also beginning to globalize at the same time, especially now with, say, the anti-Putin protests in Russia. I think what's happened is the concept of internationalism hasn't actually died. It's just changed in the way it's doing it. It's no longer, say, through international socialist parties. It's coming over Twitter, and that's a sort of limited example. I think actually what happened is the network sort of globalized. And so I don't think internationalism is dead. I just think the semantics of it is sort of, and the way it's operating has just changed. I just wondered if you'd sort of be interested in touching on that.
Thank you. It was really, really great talk. I was just wondering if you could reflect on. I've become quite interested in the NGO as a kind of as a framework, as an institutional framework, obviously in relation to the border. I was just wondering if you could add any on that, really. Basically, my knowledge of them as institutions is quite threadbare, so I'd appreciate anything on that.
Okay. So there are a couple of questions that refer to money, finance, crisis. Actually, in the work I'm doing with Brett, in this book that we have finished, so in the work I did with Brett, we devote really a lot of attention to these topics. In a way, we try to do something new from within the field of critical border studies, at least from two points of view. The first is that we are not only focused on traditionally geopolitical borders. We also look at other borders, as I was saying before. But the second element of, let's say, originality is that we try to displace the focus on political and legal concepts that characterizes critical border studies. Critical border studies are usually about sovereignty, about citizenship. We try to bring capital back in. And we really try to work on borders, on the multiplication and heterogenization of borders from the point of view of a critical analysis of contemporary capitalism. I have edited a couple of years ago with my friend Andrea Fumagalli a book on the financial crisis, which is a kind of attempt, of collective attempt to come to grips with the first moment of the financial crisis. The book was written in 2008. And in that book, we have a chapter written by another dear friend of mine, Christian Marazzi, who speaks of the financialization of capital and capitalism. This concept of financialization of capitalism plays a very important role in our book and in our analysis of borders. But what we try to do in the book is also to give a kind of historical foundation of this analysis. And we work with the concept of frontiers of capital, making, of course, a distinction between frontiers of capitals and territorial borders. And now I don't want to become boring and talking about the way in which we look at the analysis of money in John Locke in order to develop this concept. But basically, the source of inspiration for this concept is once again Marx and Marx's concept of world market, which is a really kind of amazing concept, because you don't find the concept of world market with such radicality, intensity in contemporary classical political economists. It's really kind of Marxian concept. So you have this idea, and in a famous, at least for me, passage of the Grundrisse, Marx writes that capital challenges every limit, because the existence of capital, of modern capitalism, is predicated upon the world market as horizon. And the word that Marx uses for limit is Grenze, and Grenze in German is the word for border too. No? So you have this idea of capital which challenges the very existence of borders. But at the same time, capital enters into shifting articulations between its expanding frontiers and territorial borders and boundaries. And so it is from this point of view, for instance, that we look at internationalism. that we look at the national moment in the history of capital. The national moment in the history of capital was a kind of long moment. It was a long moment in which the labor market became national. First of all, the labor market, for our interest, became national. And there was also this kind, of overlapping, steady overlapping between the figure of the worker and the figure of the citizen. And so it was through dramatic struggles that the figure of the citizen worker came into being in the national moment of capital. But in a way, working with the concept of financialization of capital provided especially by Christian, we try to show that this moment is over, which does not mean that nations do not exist anymore, which does not mean that the states do not play any important role anymore. The opposite is the case, but they play different roles. This articulation, this constellation within which frontiers of capital and territorial boundaries are articulated is changing. Finance is particularly important nowadays. To put it shortly, because otherwise we would have to speak for another hour. Finance is for us the level that commands, that exercises command upon the life, as well as upon economies and countries. And so we try to look at the shifting articulations between frontiers of capital and territorial boundaries precisely from this point of view. I put it very, very, very too schematically. The national moment of capital was also the industrial moment of capital. When we say that the industrial moment of capital is over, we don't, or at least I don't, say that there is no industry anymore. Industries are booming in many places of the world. But again, this articulation between different levels of the capitalist formation has dramatically changed. And so we are trying to understand which is the role of boundaries and borders within this new situation. Within this new situation. And then we have met the financial crisis also in a very concrete sense during our research, because I mean we had also Stefano as was in a way involved in a project that was funded by the Australian Research Council that led us to China and to India. And in September we were in India, in West Bengal, doing research in Rajarat, which is a new town, as they call it, on the fringes, on the oriental fringes, eastern fringes of Calcutta. It is a very interesting location because you have high-tech special economic zones, but you also have kind of real estate development. It is an incredible place because, you know, it's on the east of Calcutta, so you go toward the Sundarban, toward the Foce, where the Ganges meets the sea. Yeah, the delta, excuse me. the delta of the Ganges, and so you have it's an incredible, amazing place. You have a lot of fish. You had a lot of fisheries, and they have filled up the fisheries with in order to build these skyscrapers. And then you look at the sky. Many peasants were dispossessed. You know, there were dramatic struggles against dispossession. You know. But then you see the skyscrapers, most of them are not finished. And why? Because the money came from NRI, non-residential Indians, from the United States. And with the crisis of 2007 to 2008, the money stopped. You know. So it was also an interesting kind of encounter with the crisis. An encounter with the crisis from within a research that attempted, you know, to understand something about cognitive capitalism, another, you know, concept that circulates a lot in our discussions, from Rajarat. In this particular location. Well, you see, there is cognitive capitalism, you know, but if you look at Rajarat with some of the concepts or some of the lenses that have been forged in the so-called post-operaist discussion on cognitive capital, you don't understand very much, you know. So you need other tools, and maybe looking at Rajarat, looking at cognitive capitalism in Rajarat, you understand something about cognitive capitalism in London and in Milan. So this is, but this is a very important point. I would like to have more time to discuss about the way we talk about money and about no border. Yes, in a way, when I was saying that the border tends to be seen as a thing, I was thinking of some friends active in no border, in the no border network in the late 90s, and I think this is a problem. Maybe on Friday at Goldsmiths we'll have the opportunity to discuss about this. Internationalism, I have already said something, but again, I mean, for me, the problem is not the words that we use. You know, I think a specific tradition. You were saying the same before. A specific tradition of internationalism is clearly over. I was kind of emphasizing the fact that nowadays the nation cannot be the basic unit of organization of some kind of overarching understanding of struggles for change at the global level. I think that this idea of regional kind of assemblages, you know, of struggles, of movements, is an idea we should take seriously. The NGOs, this is again a very important question. A very important question. I will say just a couple of words, but it would be worth discussing at length, because NGOs have become important actors in border regimes, really many places in the world. We could even say everywhere in the world. You know. And if you look at the way in which NGOs are involved in the management of detention camps, then you see that it is a very ambivalent and blurred situation, you know, because many people working with NGOs says I wanted to be in the detention camp because I can make contribution to the humanization of living and detention conditions in the camp. But at the same time, NGOs become involved in the very management regime at the border. And if you also look at the development of the border regime in Europe at the so-called external frontiers of Europe, the involvement of NGOs has become really a fundamental element of this regime. And the involvement of the NGOs, and this is a point that we should discuss at length, means also the internalization of human rights law in the border regime. And this is a dramatic change because human rights are not anymore external to the power regime at the border. They become an element of the very power regime at the border, which does not mean that we have to abandon the idea of human rights, precisely because it has become an internal element. It can be used, and it is used by migrants for their border struggles. Some German friends of mine who have done an excellent ethnographic research in the Aegean, looking at the detention centers on the islands between Greece and Turkey, have been able to show that many migrants in certain periods of time, I don't think this is the right moment now, precisely because of the crisis, but in certain periods of time, migrants were able to use detention centers as points of entry into Europe. And this is precisely because human rights have become such an element. Just 2 words on the neoliberal politics of inclusion, another big topic, of course. What I try to do with this concept that I was just mentioning, of differential inclusion, is to show again that this clear-cut distinction between internal and external spaces and subject has been blurred. And I think it is quite easy. It is possible to show that with a detailed analysis, particularly of shifting migration regimes in Europe and in other places. We try to do that in the book, but also in the book that I edited with Étienne, Balibar, and Ranabir, Samaddar. This kind of analysis is for me connected with what I was saying before about the figure of the citizen worker. I think it is important to have a kind of awareness of the history of citizenship. And to put it shortly, there is a moment in which labor becomes the element that defines citizenship. In the West, but not only in the West. If you look at the Nehru plans, for instance, in India after independence, if you look at some Brazilian antecedents, this idea of the operario padrão, the workers that becomes empowered. So there is this element that plays an important role in the history of the 20th century. There is a British sociologist, Tom Marshall, who wrote this famous essay in 1950, Citizenship and Social Class, and in a less well-known article written at the end of the Second World War, he says in a very icastic way, we are all citizens now. There is no exclusion in the nation, of course. And we pretend that every citizen is also a worker. So it's kind of overlapping of the two figures that have been kind of disconnected for a long time. So the crisis of this figure, which is the crisis of the welfare state, of the social state, it is the neoliberal moment, has to be articulated with this analysis that I was proposing before of the blurring of the very distinction between inclusion and exclusion. And you were mentioning new citizenship. Well, there has been a lot of work on the concept of citizenship in the last 20 years. A lot of very interesting critical citizenship studies have emerged. From Étienne Balibar to Engin Eisen, I have contributed to this conversation. You know, I must say that I'm starting to become again a bit skeptical and critical about the concept of citizenship, about the use of the concept of citizenship. I have the impression that it bears the danger of obscuring rather than illuminating what is new in the political condition we are experiencing. This would be the topic for another conversation. No problem.
Is there anybody else?
Thank you for your talk and for answering so many questions. And I'm sorry, just have one last one, which is, I wondered if you'd looked at oil pipelines as, sorry, is it on? Yeah?
Yeah, it is on. But
yeah. I wondered if you'd looked at oil pipelines as both channels of flow of capital, a material flow of capital in a sense, but also oil pipelines have their own kind of transnational jurisdiction, so that they are not governed by the national laws of the countries that they pass through. And I was thinking particularly in relation to Africa in terms of contested border. It's the border around this flow of capital that is the point of struggle. I just wondered if you'd reflected on that, or if there is anything included in your book around that.
Well, thank you very much for asking this question. No, this is another very, very important point, and in a way, I am very interested in law, in legal issues and theories, and what you were saying is absolutely true and absolutely important. What we try to do in our research is to take seriously this revival of pluralist theories of law that we have experienced in the last 20 years. You know, to put it a bit simply, you have in the 20th century the two great theories of law. Carl Schmitt, we are familiar with him due to Giorgio Agamben and other fans of Carl Schmitt. And then you have Hans Kelsen. No? So a normative theory of law, a decisionist theory of law. These are slogans, but I mean, can be useful. It's quite late. So on the one hand, if you ask a question about the possibility of a global law from the point of view of these two alternative theories of law, you have with Carl Schmitt kind of political invention, production of a global order, legal order. And with Hans Kelsen, you have the development of a legal order prompted by the autonomous normativity of law. Put it a bit schematically, but what they share is the idea of the unity of the legal order. Political unity and legal unity, let's put it so. From this point of view, it is quite clear that there is no global law. But there are some very important theorists of law, jurists, that say, but no, the point is the kind of lenses you are using when looking at the actual development of law. If you look for the unity of global law, you cannot find it. Global law exists precisely because it is fragmented, precisely because it is scattered, precisely because there is a multiplicity of legal orders which are different from the point of view of the source, but all global in scope. Examples, because otherwise, if you look at a construction site, a huge construction site, in London or in Dubai, and you want to understand what is going on, you want to understand which is the condition of the workers, which is for me the most important question to be asked, which is the contract they have. It is the same contract. It is the same contract that is constructed according to the model of the so-called global lex constructionis, law of construction, which is a law that is produced by private corporate firms and has global validity. In this, during this research project I was mentioning before, we visited a factory in a special economic zone, special industrial zone, which is something else, in Shanghai, a factory that produces, quite huge factory, that produces printed circuits for computers and so on. And looking at this factory, speaking with the management as well as with some workers, we were really struck by the fact that the working condition in that factory, on the fringes of Shanghai, were basically influenced, shaped by corporate codes which have nothing to do with the Chinese law. At the same time, there is a need to articulate these different legal orders. They must be articulated, they must be ingrained. And this is a very important moment that, in a way, you can analyze from the point of view of a specific concept of border, again. Because in that factory, there are also legal borders, which means borders between different legal orders. And I think that this approach to global law provides a quite interesting key to the processes of denationalization, to quote Saskia Sassen, that shape living and working conditions in such sites as the ones that you were mentioning, along pipelines, channels, zones, and so on.
Thank you very much, Sandro, for...
I thank you.